Okay, let's go up to Anzick, Montana. So, a long time ago, like the 50s or something like that, people found kind of nestled in at the base of this little hill was a little tiny burial. And the burial had some bones in it, which is really neat. So, there were human remains, and the human remains were associated with some tools. So, you have a little antler and this antler could have had a number of purposes, but this would be kind of like what they would use to strap onto the side to hold the point in. And this is pretty clearly an early Clovis point. So, who were the Clovis people? This buried person was the Clovis people because we've got Clovis tools as grave goods with a person. So, yeah, neat. All right. So, these bones sat in back rooms at places for a while. Eventually, these bones, there was like a court fight over them, and they were repatriated. The question is like who are the nearest relatives, and you almost have to do the DNA sequencing analysis to know who that even might be. But at the same time, there's been enough stuff with people going out and digging up not that long ago dead Native Americans and or like whatever, like non-Native Americans and parading their skulls around and stuff like that. Museums, I don't know, it got some stuff to answer for. So anyway, these remains had to be repatriated and buried, and so they were sort of rushing, and they got a nice DNA sequence out of these remains. And so that's useful because then you can say, all right, who are these? How do they fit into our story of evolution? And they also importantly extracted some collagen protein, which can be sort of sequenced and analyzed as well from this mummy. And so those are the only things that remain outside of the ground. Everything else has been reburied. I think the tools are still in a museum because no point reburying those. Those are really interesting and important artifacts. And so, all right, they called this person Anzick 1 because it's the first person from Anzick they had sequenced, and there's only one there, so that's the one. And Anzick 1 is really closely related to people you would find in Central and South America. So there's the idea that you get people coming over in waves, and the first wave goes all the way down to the bottom, and then subsequent waves wash over, but they just get like a little ways in over here. And so this person is probably part of an early wave or a holdover from that. And yeah, genetically very close to all the people of Central and South America who are genetically very similar. The ones that are going back to sort of pre Columbian ancestors, anyway, which is what they're comparing to. All right. And from the Anzick 1 data that they were able to pull out, they're able to fractionate some of this. And I believe this was done from I want to say it was done from the collagen. But you can fractionate the different isotopes of nitrogen. And what you find is that the closer something is to eating plants, you'll get a bias toward low amounts, low delta 15 nitrogen. And in things that eat animals that eat plants, you basically concentrate this. And so in animals that just eat a ton of plants, like big mammoths and stuff that are just packing in tons of greens all the time, they're going to have higher but sort of intermediate values. And then among carnivores, which are all these sort of red things, carnivores and omnivores, yeah, as if those are different, you'll have generally higher 15N and higher delta 13C. Yeah. And so these are reflecting differences in diet that get sort of concentrated as you go up the food chain, which is kind of neat. From this, they're able to figure out that the baby is putting in proteins that are right about here. So it's like it is feeding on something. It's feeding on its mother's milk. And they have measured like what is transmitted in mother's milk, and so this is their estimate for what the mother was eating, which is kind of a range of herbivorous animals. And then the mothers, a little bit of the mother's reconstructed actual diet would put her as pretty close to a carnivore, essentially. So this is what she's eating. She's eating things like bison and camels and lots of mammoths, tasty mammoths, and that makes her more like a carnivore. So it's a neat analysis. I'm not close enough to it to tell you where the weak spots are, but it's very interesting and very new. So there you go. Anyway, so what if you expand this to all of humans? Say, okay, humans of the world, who are you? How do you match up? There are different groups that have at times been called pygmies. That's a very outdated, kind of problematic term. And also, some of these people average like 6 feet tall. So, pygmy compared to what? Yeah. But these are some of the populations, and they turn out to be very early human ancestors. So this is the first thing that we had. We said, okay, we have like earlier human ancestors and some of these more possibly isolated populations in Central, and there's some others in Southern Africa. And then they go a little later and they check and say, okay, and how much of this DNA is going to contain bits of Neanderthal DNA. So we have Neanderthal genomes, we have human genomes, and we can say, all right, how close is this human genome? How many Neanderthal alleles does it have? And you can see there's a range. There are different populations with a range, but essentially, the ones that come out closest to ancestrally modern are basically people in Central and Southern Africa. So the only ones that are more human and less Neanderthal are African people. Yeah, they're the true humans among us. So what do you know? Yeah, that's kind of cool. All right, who are these Neanderthals? Well, they look like this dude. Look at that. That's a strong beard to hide a weak chin. Yeah. But the idea is short and stocky, and their chests were a little more round, barrel chested, just like more expanded rib bones. They stick out a little more. But there's a range on modern humans that would overlap to some extent with this. And a decent sized brow ridge, although you find some people that have more of an expressed brow ridge, and whatever, nothing wrong with that. The sequencing of Neanderthal DNA, so these things only die out around 32,000 years ago, which is pretty recent. Yeah, it's just before recorded history, but it is after a lot of those arrow points develop, for example, and a lot of technology. There is some art that appears to be Neanderthal art. There are customs that appear to be Neanderthal customs, and burials, stuff like that. Yeah, so kind of interesting area. One of the things that happens to ancient DNA, like one of the first things that happens, is the DNA is going to combine with water just from the cell that it's in, because cells are mostly water. And you're going to lose these little nitrogens here, and so you're going to deaminate. And I think you're going to turn a C into a U effectively, nucleotide, by doing that. It is possible to correct for this or just to ignore all the C's and line the stuff around them and then figure out what they might have been. And then other changes you can actually say are definitely changes. So, this is a study where they got some Neanderthal remains from several different sites all across sort of Europe and Eurasia. Yeah. And they sequenced a whole bunch of Neanderthal genomes. There are a few of these papers out now, and it's kind of interesting. What you see here over time is that there are, so if these are each of the chromosomes, the black dot is the centromere, like the little central point where the mitotic spindle will attach. And you have patches of red things up here, and the patches of red things seem to be Neanderthal lineages. So those seem to come from Neanderthals. The blue things may come from a different patch of Neanderthals. These are lineages that would be more common in some parts of Asia, but they may also be from a different group that are not Neanderthals. They are Denisovans. So there's a Denisova cave, and there have been some human remains recovered there. I guess not human, Denisovan. Yeah, because they're not Homo sapiens, they're Homo Denisova. And like one of these was just a tooth. A couple others are little finger bones from a couple different people. And so they've got several genomes now of these. And what they can find is that they've got this Denisovan DNA. So they're hominid-like. They look like humans. They were around at the same time, although on the earlier side. They definitely coexisted with Neanderthals and just barely maybe overlapped with humans, but maybe not as much in the same places. But like in Denisova Cave, you have several individuals that have the pure Denisovan genome that's as different as possible from these other things. You've got individuals that are a one-to-one mix. So they have one parent that is a Neanderthal and one parent that is a Denisovan. Yeah, really cool. Some mixture. And you've got living remains in the same cave. You've got at least one person that has full Neanderthal who's buried there, and one person who's pretty close to full Denisovan, just a little Neanderthal. And so there may have been considerable mixing of these groups, particularly Neanderthals and Denisovans, at least early on. And then later on, you'll get some mixing between humans and Neanderthals. But the humans don't seem to mix quite as well or as readily. Yeah. And was it a cultural thing? Did we just not look, as good as those Neanderthals? Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. All down to taste, right? So here's a phylogenetic tree of the different mitochondrial DNAs from some of these creatures. And here's the pure Denisovans. Here's some Neanderthals. They're their own group. So mitochondrial DNA is going to come down in the egg, not in the sperm. So it's going to be from the mother's side only. And then over here you see all the early branches have an AFR at the beginning, and those are from Africa. And then some of these later branches are going to be Asia, America, Europe, whatever, Australia. Even the original Australasian people, Aborigines, are actually fairly derived in terms of this. They have different sets of acquired DNA from other species, but still relatively late comers in genetic terms, late branching. Yeah. So you end up with all these situations. You had Denisovans, you had Homo sapiens, you had Neanderthals. Apparently, all of these could interbreed to some extent. We don't know how many times they tried. We just know some of the cases where they succeeded. Yeah, so yeah, whatever that means. But we've got evidence for gene flow from some of those Homo erectus into Neanderthals. We've got potential evidence for Neanderthals interbreeding with Denisovans and with different groups, like sort of Asian groups and more European groups of humans, and all kinds of stuff happening in Africa as well. And yeah, that's our story. Now, part of our other legacy is that when we inherit genes from these other hominids, we also inherit their embedded viruses. So viruses like HIV will leave little signatures. It's actually their whole genome. They just put it into your genome over and over again. And so you've got millions of copies of HIV-like viruses in various semi-broken to completely broken states. Some of the parts still work at different times, and cause sort of unpredictable outcomes. But you can see the exact same retrovirus in the exact same context, the exact same spot in the genome between Denisovans and humans, and also between Neanderthals and humans. And so we definitely share their DNA because we have the same, like, these are each chance events. When one person gets a virus, it inserts randomly in the genome. So you're not going to get exactly the same virus inserted at exactly the same point, except by extreme random luck, because our genome is what, trillions of bases long, and so the odds that you get the same virus at the same place close enough to zero that it didn't happen. And so yeah, this is proof positive. It's in the viruses. And then some more recent studies have focused on gene flow. So you've got some of these early sort of human Neanderthal crosses. So the red parts are Neanderthal parts. And you can see they start out with a lot of sort of red in there. And then as time goes on, the Neanderthals are going extinct around 30,000, I think, years ago. And so it's just Homo sapiens that you can breed with, ones that have bred with Neanderthals, some of them. And so this Neanderthal heritage gets reduced, and it's reduced by a combination of things. So you got positive selection of some traits, negative selection of other traits if they have some sort of harmful selection. Anyway, from this, you can go back, and from these genomes of like very early humans and later humans and modern humans, you can go back and reconstruct that all the interbreeding happens in this. It's about a 7,000 year long pulse of the free love period, kind of centered around 47,000 years ago. And that's where most of the Neanderthal to human gene flow occurs. And toward the end of this, there were still Neanderthals around, but they're getting fewer in number and eventually going extinct right around there. And then after that, it's all just us, unfortunately. And Denisovans are more like back here, I think. Okay, what other tech did these cave people, dumb way to describe them, have? Well, if you go to these cave paintings across Europe, these are things that are going to be 10,000, 20,000, 30,000 years old. And so they're going to be made probably by Homo sapiens, although some of these are potentially old enough they could be Neanderthal. Anyway, on a lot of these, you will find a series of little dots, often in a contrasting color, or little lines, and sometimes the lines will have like a little Y on the end of them. And so the question was, are these just decoration or are they something more? And somebody's figured out, it's still a little controversial, but it looks like it's holding up. It came out in 2023 and seems to still be state of the art. It looks like what they're marking here is how many months until, like full moons, until the mating season for these. Because when they're mating, they're running around like crazy. There's a lot of them, and it's a good time to hunt them. And then they're also marking on there like how many months then until they give birth. And so they think the little Y mark, the little forked thing, is the point at which they give birth. And so it's a little calendar, essentially. So then they're trying to figure out, like, okay, if it is a calendar, that's like a good hypothesis. What's the calendar measuring like from? Because they didn't know about Christmas yet, I'm pretty sure. And they didn't know about New Year's Day, that it's got to be just this time. So the one that makes the most sense is if they go from basically the first bloom of spring, like when the crocuses come out or when the bluebells appear, something like that, but like the local equivalent of that, because we know when that is, and those dates line up pretty well with the numbers that you get attached to the animals. And a particular animal will have a characteristic number, although if you're higher in the mountain, it may be like an extra month like later, because things might work a little different up there. Yeah, it's people taking notes on when the good hunting is, when the good fishing is. That seems to be the interpretation, and that's really cool. They're not just awesome pictures; they're awesome pictures that tell us something. All right. Here's another, and I forget if this is early hominid or even pre-human. But here we have a little drawing. It's like little scratches on the rock. And the little scratches are in sort of crisscrosses. And then incised really deep in those crisscrosses, look, you've got little fish shapes. That's our cats fighting. Yeah. And the little fish shapes are probably showing that they're either using nets or baskets to catch fish. It's like a little drawing of some human tech, is how it's interpreted now. And that's really cool. Yeah. Um, Also, while we're on the path of interesting things, there are burials from northern Morocco, and these are from about 15,000 years ago. This is the kind of early in the Green Sahara period, when the Sahara is lush, mostly underwater, full of hippos and tons of water birds and fish and maybe dolphins. Yeah. And this is cyclical, it comes and goes, wet and dry. But in this human remains, they found a bunch of little ephedra seeds. And if you know ephedra, it's an upper drug. And So we don't know if these people are chewing, if it's like a funeral thing, or if it's a thing that this person really liked. We've got to bury them with their stash of drugs. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. Or if this just makes you feel better when somebody dies, you have a little ephedra and things aren't so bad. I have no idea, and do not take this any interpret this further in your lives. But it's kind of neat. People are using things, yeah. Ancient humans, not so different. And then the crowning achievement of humanity. At several sites, and some of these are sites that are potentially Homo sapiens, like early Homo sapiens, we think. Some may be slightly older. They may be like Neanderthal. It's hard to tell with some of them. But they have gone in there, and this one's associated with a Neanderthal burial. And some of these others are also associated with Neanderthal remains. In these caves, you will sometimes find fossils that did not come from the caves and have no business being in the caves. Fossils like these that were probably picked up by little Neanderthal kids, and they brought them home just like I used to do, and they, kept them in the cave, and then they just left them on the floor like kids do, and eventually they got worn in there. So and there's evidence of this happening at a lot of different sites. They're all the little numbers that are marked on the background over here, across Europe and Africa. So little early human and Neanderthal kids collecting fossils. Was it humankind's destiny to collect and understand fossils? I'd like to think it was. I'd like to think that's the entire point of this class. Yeah. We're just doing what comes naturally. I hope you enjoyed it. This has been great. It's my favorite one to teach. So yeah, thanks a lot. This is the last lecture. See you.